Why Viking homes never froze, even in Arctic winters. When you hear the word Viking, you probably imagine frozen landscapes, endless snow, icy winds, and people barely surviving brutal Arctic winters. It feels logical to assume that Viking homes must have been unbearably cold, drafty, and miserable. But here's the surprising truth: Viking homes didn't freeze. In fact, many of them stayed remarkably warm, even during some of the harshest winters in Northern Europe. And the most shocking part? They managed this without modern insulation, electricity, central heating, or advanced tools. No radiators. No heaters. No glass windows like we have today. Yet Viking families lived, slept, worked, cooked, and even raised children comfortably through long, dark winters that lasted months. So how did they do it? The answer lies in smart design, deep understanding of nature, and building techniques that modern architecture is only now beginning to appreciate again. Viking homes were not primitive shelters thrown together in desperation. They were carefully engineered survival systems designed to trap heat, block wind, and make the most of every available resource. To understand why Viking homes never froze, we need to start by changing how we think about Viking life altogether. Vikings didn't build houses to look impressive. They built houses to survive. The most common Viking home was known as the longhouse. These were not small huts or temporary shelters. Longhouses could stretch anywhere from 15 to over 75 meters long, depending on the wealth and importance of the family living inside. Entire families, servants, animals, and supplies often shared one long structure. That might sound chaotic, but it was actually one of their biggest advantages. One of the first reasons Viking homes stayed warm was shared heat. Humans generate heat. Animals generate even more heat. By housing livestock such as sheep, goats, and sometimes cattle inside or directly adjacent to living spaces, Vikings created a natural heating system. Body warmth from animals slowly radiated into the living areas, especially at night when temperatures dropped the most. Modern people often cringe at the idea of living with animals indoors, but for Vikings, this wasn't filth, it was survival. Warmth mattered more than comfort, and animals were valuable sources of heat that required no fuel. Another major reason Viking homes didn't freeze was how they were built into the land. Vikings understood something that modern builders sometimes forget: the earth itself is an incredible insulator. Many Viking homes were partially dug into the ground. Floors were often set lower than the surrounding terrain, and walls rose from earth-packed foundations. This design reduced exposure to icy winds and stabilized indoor temperatures. The ground stays relatively warm compared to freezing air temperatures, even in winter. By embedding part of the house into the earth, Vikings used the planet itself as a thermal blanket. Then there were the walls. Viking walls were incredibly thick, sometimes over 1 meter wide. These weren't thin wooden planks like you'd see in later medieval houses. Instead, walls were built using layers of stone, turf, clay, timber, and earth packed tightly together. Turf was especially important. Turf is not just dirt, it includes dense grass roots, soil, and organic material. When stacked and compressed, turf traps air inside it. That trapped air acts as insulation, much like modern foam insulation in houses today. Turf walls absorbed heat during the day and slowly released it at night. This thermal mass helped regulate indoor temperatures and prevented sudden drops during freezing conditions. In other words, Viking homes didn't just block the cold, they stored warmth. The roofs were just as clever. Viking roofs were typically made from wooden beams covered with thick layers of turf or thatch. This made roofs heavy, but weight was actually an advantage. Heavy roofs sealed tightly against wind, preventing drafts from sneaking in. Turf roofs added another insulating layer, keeping heat inside and cold air outside. Snow accumulating on top of the roof during winter actually helped insulate the house even more. Instead of being a problem, Snow became part of the insulation system. Inside the home, the heart of warmth was the central fire. Most Viking homes had a long, open hearth running through the center of the house. Fires were kept burning almost constantly during winter. Unlike modern fireplaces that send heat straight up the chimney, Viking hearths were designed to spread heat throughout the space. Smoke drifted upward and slowly escaped through roof vents or gaps, but not quickly. This meant warm air stayed inside longer. Yes, the homes were smoky by modern standards, but that smoke also served a purpose. It helped preserve wood, deter insects, and reduce moisture. The smoke also trapped heat near the ceiling, creating a temperature gradient where the upper parts of the house stayed warmer. Sleeping platforms were often raised slightly off the ground to take advantage of this warmer air. Speaking of sleeping, Viking beds were nothing like modern ones. Beds were often built into the walls or arranged along the sides of the longhouse. They were filled with straw, hay, feathers, or animal skins. These materials provided excellent insulation. Thick wool blankets and fur cloaks trapped body heat, keeping sleepers warm even during freezing nights. Families often slept close together, sharing warmth. Privacy was sacrificed for survival, and warmth was always prioritized. Another reason Viking homes stayed warm was minimal openings. Windows, if they existed at all, were small and often covered with animal hide, cloth, or thin slices of horn. Glass was extremely rare and expensive. Small openings meant less heat loss. Doors were also designed carefully. They were low and narrow, forcing people to duck when entering. This reduced the amount of warm air that escaped every time the door opened. The overall shape of Viking homes mattered too. Longhouses were aerodynamic. Their low profile and curved or slanted roofs reduced wind resistance. Instead of fighting Arctic winds, Viking homes let the wind flow over them. Less wind pressure meant fewer drafts and less heat loss. Orientation also played a role. Homes were often positioned to take advantage of sunlight and to shield entrances from prevailing winds. Vikings observed their environment closely and adapted their architecture accordingly. Fuel efficiency was another critical factor. Wood was valuable, especially in areas where trees were scarce. Vikings couldn't afford to waste fuel. Their hearths were designed to burn efficiently, and homes were sealed tightly enough that fires didn't need to work as hard to maintain warmth. Dung from animals was sometimes dried and used as fuel as well, especially in treeless regions like Iceland. This burned slowly and steadily, producing long-lasting heat. Let's talk about Iceland specifically, because this is where Viking engineering truly shines. When Vikings settled Iceland, they faced some of the coldest conditions imaginable. Trees were limited, winds were fierce, and winters were long. Yet archaeological evidence shows that Icelandic Viking homes were some of the warmest and most insulated structures of their time. These homes were almost entirely built from turf and stone, with massive walls and deeply sunken floors. Some were so well insulated that ice could form outside while temperatures inside remained relatively stable. Modern reconstructions of Viking turf houses in Iceland show that even without modern heating, indoor temperatures can stay surprisingly comfortable when a small fire is burning. Vikings also managed moisture extremely well. Cold isn't the only danger in winter. Dampness can kill faster than freezing temperatures. Turf walls absorbed moisture and released it slowly. Smoke helped dry the interior. Raised wooden platforms kept people off cold, damp ground. Everything worked together as a system. This is the key point most people miss. Viking homes weren't warm because of one single trick. They were warm because every design choice supported the same goal. Thick walls, turf roofs, shared living spaces, central fires, minimal openings, earth insulation, animal heat, all of it worked together. Nothing was accidental. Even the social structure supported warmth. Families gathered in one place. People worked indoors during winter. Movement was limited to preserve heat. Daily life slowed down, conserving energy and fuel. Modern houses, by contrast, often fight nature instead of working with it. Thin walls rely on artificial heating. Large windows lose heat. High ceilings let warmth escape. Viking homes were low, dense, and grounded. There's a lesson here that goes far beyond history. Today, architects and environmental designers are rediscovering principles Vikings mastered over 1,000 years ago. Passive heating, thermal mass, earth-sheltered design, natural insulation, compact living spaces. These ideas aren't new. They're ancient. Vikings survived Arctic winters not because they were tougher or stronger than us, but because they understood their environment deeply. They respected nature instead of ignoring it. They built homes that responded to climate instead of resisting it. So no, Viking homes didn't freeze. They endured. They protected. They worked. And in some ways, they were smarter than many modern buildings we live in today. The next time you imagine a Viking shivering in a frozen hut, remember this. While blizzards raged outside and darkness stretched on for months, Viking families gathered around warm hearths, sharing food, stories, and life, inside homes that were quietly, brilliantly engineered to survive the cold. Inside daily life of a Viking winter. Winter for the Vikings was not a season they tried to defeat. It was a season they prepared for, accepted, and adapted to. Once the first heavy snows arrived and daylight shortened to just a few hours, life slowed down in ways that might feel unfamiliar to us today. But slowing down didn't mean doing nothing. Viking winters were full, busy, and carefully structured around survival, warmth, and community. When winter truly set in, most travel stopped. Seas froze or became too dangerous to navigate, roads disappeared under snow, and long-distance journeys were postponed until spring. This meant Viking families spent weeks or even months almost entirely inside their longhouses. These homes became the center of everything: work, rest, social life, and survival. Daily life usually began late by modern standards. With very little daylight, there was no reason to wake before sunrise. Conserving energy was important, especially during the coldest months. People rose when there was enough light to work by, and much of that light came not from the sun, but from the hearth fire. The hearth was always the heart of winter life. It burned from morning until night, and often through the night as well. Someone in the household was always responsible for feeding the fire, adding wood, peat, or dried dung to keep it alive. Letting the fire go out in winter wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Restarting a fire in freezing conditions was difficult, and the loss of heat could quickly make the house unlivable. Most activities took place around this fire. People sat close to it, not only for warmth but for light. The flickering flames illuminated hands busy with work that didn't require much space but demanded time and patience. Winter was the season of indoor labor. Men and women alike spent hours repairing tools, sharpening blades, fixing fishing nets, mending sails, and crafting items that couldn't be made during the busy farming months. Weapons were cleaned and maintained, but winter was not a season of war. It was a season of preparation. Women often focused on textile work, which was essential for survival. Spinning wool, weaving cloth, sewing garments, and repairing worn clothing took up enormous amounts of time. Wool was incredibly valuable, and nothing was wasted. Thick winter clothing made from wool and animal skins was the difference between comfort and suffering. Children were always present, learning simply by watching. There were no classrooms or formal lessons. Skills were passed down naturally: how to spin yarn, how to carve wood, how to recognize the sound of a fire that needed feeding. Winter was when stories were told, and these stories taught history, values, and survival lessons all at once. Food during winter was simple but carefully managed. By the time winter arrived, Viking households had already prepared months' worth of supplies. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried. Fish was preserved the same way. Dairy products like butter and cheese were stored in cool conditions. Grains were kept dry and ground slowly into flour as needed. Fresh food was rare. There were no vegetables growing, no fruit trees producing. Meals were filling rather than exciting. Stews were common because they could be cooked slowly over the fire and fed many people at once. These stews often contained dried meat, grains, and whatever preserved ingredients were available. Eating was a communal activity. Everyone ate together, usually seated on benches or sleeping platforms near the walls. Sharing meals conserved heat and reinforced social bonds. No one ate alone in winter unless they were sick or injured. Warmth was always managed carefully. People wore layers even indoors. Wool tunics, cloaks, and leg wraps were common. Shoes lined with fur or stuffed with straw helped keep feet warm. At night, clothing was often worn while sleeping, along with heavy blankets and furs. Sleeping arrangements were practical rather than private. Families slept close together, sometimes multiple people sharing the same sleeping platform. This shared body heat made nights much more bearable. Children slept between adults, where it was warmest. Animals played a constant role in winter life. Livestock that weren't slaughtered before winter were kept close, sometimes inside part of the longhouse or in attached byres. Their presence added warmth and ensured they survived the cold. Caring for animals was a daily task, even in freezing weather. They needed feeding, cleaning, and protection from the elements. The sounds and smells of animals were simply part of life. For Vikings, this wasn't unpleasant, it was normal. Winter was also a deeply social season. With little outdoor work, people talked more. They shared stories, recited poetry, and passed down oral history. Sagas, legends, and family histories were remembered and retold during long winter nights. These stories preserved knowledge and identity in a world without written records for most people. Games were played too. Board games like Oniffertafel, a strategy game similar to chess, helped pass time and sharpen the mind. Riddles, jokes, and friendly competitions kept spirits up during the darkest months. This social closeness wasn't optional. Isolation in winter could be deadly. Humans needed each other for warmth, help, and mental resilience. Viking culture valued togetherness because survival demanded it. Winter also had a spiritual side. Vikings believed the winter months were a time when the boundary between worlds grew thin. Many rituals and beliefs were tied to darkness, cold, and the return of the sun. Midwinter festivals marked the turning point of the year, celebrating that the days would slowly begin to lengthen again. These gatherings weren't just religious, they were emotional anchors. They reminded people that winter was temporary, that light would return, and that survival was possible. Despite all this warmth and activity, winter life was still hard. Cold seeped into bones. Smoke irritated eyes and lungs. Food became repetitive. Space was limited. Arguments happened. But Viking homes were designed to handle this reality. Their architecture supported long-term indoor living without breaking families apart. People adapted their expectations. Winter wasn't meant to be productive in the modern sense. It was meant to be endured wisely. One of the most important winter skills Vikings practiced was patience. They didn't rush the season. They didn't waste fuel trying to keep spaces overly warm. They accepted cooler indoor temperatures as normal. Their bodies were accustomed to it. Their clothing was designed for it. Their routines respected it. In many ways, Viking winters were quieter but more human than modern winters. No screens. No artificial brightness. No constant noise. Just firelight, voices, work, and rest. And all of it happened inside homes that held warmth not just physically, but socially. Winter life wasn't about surviving alone. It was about surviving together. And that, more than anything, is why Viking homes and Viking communities endured the Arctic winter year after year. Viking homes versus medieval castles, which was warmer and why? When people imagine medieval life, they often picture massive stone castles with towering walls and roaring fireplaces, and they assume those castles must have been far warmer and more comfortable than anything Vikings lived in. After all, castles were symbols of power, wealth, and progress, while Viking homes are often dismissed as crude or primitive. But the reality is almost the opposite. In many cases, Viking homes were far warmer and more livable in winter than medieval castles ever were. To understand why, we need to stop judging warmth by size, height, or appearance, and start judging it by how well a structure manages heat. Let's start with Viking homes. Viking longhouses were built low to the ground. They were compact, dense, and designed to trap heat. Thick turf walls, earth-packed foundations, and heavy roofs worked together to create insulation on all sides. Heat generated inside the home stayed inside. Wind was blocked. Cold air had very few ways to enter. Now compare that to medieval castles. Castles were built primarily for defense, not comfort. Their thick stone walls look impressive, but stone is a terrible insulator. It absorbs cold easily and takes a long time to warm up. In winter, castle walls were often icy to the touch on the inside. Even when fires burned in castle fireplaces, much of the heat was lost. Large open hearths sent warm air straight up tall chimneys. High ceilings allowed heat to rise far above where people actually lived. Huge rooms required enormous amounts of fuel just to feel slightly warm. Viking homes avoided this problem by staying low. Ceilings in longhouses were relatively close to head height. Warm air had nowhere to escape. Heat from the hearth filled the living space instead of disappearing overhead. This single design choice made a massive difference in winter comfort. Another key difference was size. Viking homes were built only as large as necessary. Families lived close together in shared spaces. Castles, on the other hand, were intentionally vast. Great halls, long corridors, stone staircases, and unused rooms created endless cold air pockets. A Viking family could heat their entire living space with one central fire. A medieval lord could burn multiple fireplaces and still feel cold. Windows were another major factor. Viking homes had very small openings. Some had no windows at all. If they did, they were covered with animal hide, cloth, or horn. These materials reduced airflow and trapped heat. Medieval castles, especially later ones, featured larger windows for light and status. Glass, when used, was thin and poorly sealed. Many windows were left uncovered or had shutters that leaked cold air relentlessly. Wind passed freely through castle rooms, making them drafty and uncomfortable. Doors tell the same story. Viking doors were low and narrow. People had to bend to enter, which minimized heat loss. Doors fit tightly into thick walls, creating natural airlocks. Castle doors were massive and tall, often opening into wide halls. Every opening allowed cold air to rush in and warm air to escape. Then there's the matter of floors. Viking homes often had packed earth floors or wooden platforms raised slightly off the ground. Animal skins, straw, and rugs provided insulation. Feet stayed relatively warm. Castles had stone floors. Cold stone floors absorbed heat constantly. Even with rugs, the cold crept upward. This is why medieval nobles often wore multiple layers indoors and used foot warmers. Now let's talk about heating philosophy. Vikings heated people, not space. Their goal wasn't to warm every corner of the house. It was to keep human bodies warm. Firelight, thick clothing, shared sleeping areas, and insulated beds all worked together to achieve this. Castles tried to heat space. This was far less efficient. Large rooms required massive fuel consumption. Fires burned constantly, yet comfort was still limited. Only those sitting closest to the fire felt warm. Everyone else stayed cold. Social structure made a difference too. Viking homes were communal. Everyone shared the same warmth, the same fire, the same space. Heat was conserved naturally because people gathered together. Castles were hierarchical. Servants slept in cold corridors or storage areas. Even nobles often slept in chilly chambers far from the main hearth. Animals were another hidden advantage for Vikings. Livestock kept indoors or nearby provided constant body heat. Their warmth contributed to the overall temperature of the structure. Castles kept animals outside, far from living quarters. Stables were separate, and animal heat was wasted from a survival standpoint. Moisture control also favored Viking homes. Turf walls absorbed moisture and released it slowly. Smoke from hearth fires dried the interior and reduced dampness. Dry air feels warmer and is healthier in cold conditions. Castles, especially stone ones, were notoriously damp. Water seeped through stone walls. Condensation formed in winter. Damp cold is far more uncomfortable and dangerous than dry cold. Historical records actually support this comparison. Many medieval accounts describe castles as miserable in winter. Nobles traveled frequently, not just for politics, but to escape cold residences. Some castles were abandoned seasonally because they were too uncomfortable to inhabit year-round. Viking homes, by contrast, were occupied continuously through winter. They were designed for it. This leads to an important realization. Progress isn't always a straight line. Castles represented political power and military strength, but not environmental intelligence. Viking homes represented adaptation, efficiency, and survival. In terms of warmth alone, Viking homes often outperformed castles despite being simpler, smaller, and cheaper to build. This doesn't mean Viking life was luxurious. It wasn't. But it was practical. Vikings didn't try to dominate nature with stone and height. They worked with nature using earth, turf, and compact design. In winter, that approach mattered more than grandeur. So if you were forced to spend a freezing medieval winter with no modern heating, you'd probably be warmer sleeping in a Viking longhouse than in a towering stone castle. And that simple fact flips our assumptions about history upside down. Because sometimes, the smartest buildings aren't the biggest ones. They're the ones that understand the cold. What modern homes can learn from Viking architecture? Modern homes are often described as advanced, efficient, and technologically superior. We have insulation, central heating, smart thermostats, and powerful materials that Vikings could never have imagined. And yet, many modern homes struggle to stay warm without constant energy input. The moment the power goes out or fuel becomes expensive, comfort disappears. Viking homes didn't have that problem. They were designed to work even when resources were limited. And that's exactly why modern architecture is quietly rediscovering many of the principles Vikings used over 1,000 years ago. The first lesson modern homes can learn from Viking architecture is build for the climate, not the trend. Viking homes looked the way they did because the environment demanded it. Cold winds, heavy snow, limited fuel, and long winters shaped every design decision. Nothing was built just to impress. Every feature had a purpose tied directly to survival. Modern homes are often built to look the same whether they are in cold regions, hot regions, or coastal areas. Style frequently overrides climate. Vikings would have seen this as wasteful and dangerous. A house should respond to where it exists. Another powerful lesson is compact design saves heat. Viking homes were not oversized. They were only as large as they needed to be. Smaller spaces are easier to heat, easier to insulate, and easier to maintain. Heat doesn't have to travel far, and it doesn't have many places to escape. Modern homes often prioritize open plans, high ceilings, and vast unused spaces. These features feel luxurious but are energy traps. Heat rises, spreads, and vanishes. Viking homes stayed warm because warmth had nowhere to go. Then there's the lesson of thermal mass. Vikings didn't rely on thin walls with artificial insulation. They used heavy materials like turf, earth, stone, and clay. These materials absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. This creates stable indoor temperatures instead of sudden highs and lows. Modern builders are returning to this idea through materials like rammed earth, concrete, adobe, and thick masonry. These aren't new innovations. They're ancient ideas rebranded with modern names. Viking homes prove that heavy walls aren't a disadvantage, they're an asset when used correctly. Another major takeaway is insulation doesn't have to be synthetic. Turf, straw, wool, animal hair, and earth all acted as natural insulators in Viking homes. These materials trapped air, resisted wind, and managed moisture effectively. Today, many eco-friendly homes use sheep's wool insulation, straw bale walls, and green roofs. These are not experimental concepts. They are direct descendants of Viking building methods. Nature already solved the insulation problem. Vikings simply paid attention. Modern homes can also learn from roof design. Viking roofs were heavy, sloped, and well sealed. Snow accumulation wasn't feared, it was welcomed because it added insulation. Roofs were designed to stay tight against the structure, preventing wind from lifting or penetrating them. Modern roofs are often designed to shed snow as quickly as possible, which can increase heat loss. In cold climates, controlled snow retention and green roofs can dramatically improve insulation. Again, Vikings didn't fight winter, they used it. Another overlooked lesson is window restraint. Viking homes limited openings because they understood that every hole in a wall is a weakness in winter. Light mattered, but warmth mattered more. Modern homes love large windows. While beautiful, they are responsible for massive heat loss. Even high-quality glass cannot match the insulating power of a solid wall. Viking architecture teaches balance. Light is important, but not at the cost of thermal efficiency. Strategic placement beats excess. Orientation is another area where Vikings were surprisingly advanced. Homes were positioned to avoid dominant winds and maximize sunlight. Entrances faced away from storms. Walls shielded living spaces. This wasn't written in books, it was learned through observation. Modern urban planning often ignores wind patterns and solar angles. Viking builders would have considered that careless. Then there's the lesson of heating people, not space. Vikings didn't try to make indoor air feel like summer. They dressed warmly, used insulated bedding, and gathered together. Fire was used efficiently, not extravagantly. Modern heating systems aim for uniform temperature everywhere, which wastes enormous energy. Zoned heating, localized warmth, and personal insulation are all ideas Vikings practiced instinctively. Another lesson modern homes can learn is resilience over dependence. Viking homes functioned without external systems. No electricity. No fuel pipelines. No fragile infrastructure. Their houses worked because of design, not machines. Modern homes often collapse into discomfort when systems fail. Viking architecture reminds us that a truly good home should still be livable under stress. Perhaps the most important lesson is architecture shapes behavior. Viking homes encouraged togetherness, shared warmth, and cooperation. People gathered naturally around the hearth. Life slowed down in winter, conserving energy. Modern homes often isolate people into separate rooms, each requiring separate heating, lighting, and devices. Comfort becomes individual instead of collective. Viking homes show us that social design can be energy efficient too. There's also something deeply sustainable about Viking architecture. Materials were local. Construction was simple. Repairs were easy. When a house reached the end of its life, it returned to the earth without pollution. Modern homes often rely on complex supply chains, non-renewable materials, and systems that are expensive to maintain or replace. Viking homes were temporary in the best sense. They were part of a cycle, not a permanent scar on the landscape. All of this leads to a surprising conclusion. Modern architecture is not ahead of Viking architecture in every way. In some areas, it is still catching up. The future of sustainable housing may look less like glass towers and more like earth-sheltered homes, green roofs, compact designs, and passive heating systems. In other words, the future may look a lot like the past. Viking builders didn't have degrees, blueprints, or simulations. They had observation, experience, and necessity. And that was enough to create homes that endured some of the harshest winters on Earth. If modern homes listened to those ancient lessons, they wouldn't need to work so hard to stay warm. They would simply work. When Viking homes failed, the limits of their design. As effective as Viking homes were, they were not perfect. They were brilliant solutions for survival in harsh climates, but they also had limits. Understanding when and why Viking homes failed gives us a more honest picture of Viking life. One that includes hardship, loss, and adaptation, not just clever design. The first and most obvious limitation was dependence on preparation. Viking homes worked best when everything went right. When fuel was stored properly, when food supplies were sufficient, and when the hearth fire was maintained. If any of these systems failed, the home could quickly become dangerous. Running out of fuel in winter was one of the worst scenarios imaginable. Without a constant fire, even the best insulated Viking home could grow cold. Thick walls slowed heat loss, but they couldn't create warmth on their own. In extreme cold, the absence of fire could turn survival into a race against time. This made Viking households extremely vulnerable to poor planning, bad harvests, or unexpected population increases. Another major limitation was smoke. Viking homes did not have modern chimneys. Smoke escaped through roof vents or gaps, which meant indoor air was often thick with smoke. While this helped preserve wood and reduce pests, it also caused constant irritation. Eyes burned. Lungs suffered. Over long winters, breathing smoky air every day likely led to chronic health problems. Archaeological evidence suggests many Vikings had respiratory issues, even if they didn't understand the cause. Warmth came at a cost. Space was another issue. Viking homes were warm partly because they were crowded. Privacy was minimal. Everyone shared the same space, the same sounds, the same smells. This could strain relationships, especially during long winters when people had little escape. Illness spread easily in close quarters. If one person became sick, the entire household was at risk. Isolation, which we now use to prevent disease, was nearly impossible. Then there was fire risk. Open hearths burned constantly. Sparks flew. Embers fell. A single mistake could start a fire that destroyed the entire home. Turf and thatch, while insulating, were also flammable when dry. Fires in Viking settlements could spread quickly, especially when homes were built close together. A warm home could become a deadly trap in minutes. Weather extremes also tested the limits of Viking design. While turf homes handled cold well, they struggled in prolonged wet conditions. Heavy rain could saturate walls. If drainage failed, moisture could weaken structures and reduce insulation. In coastal or storm-prone regions, strong winds could damage roofs. Constant maintenance was required. A neglected home didn't stay warm for long. Viking homes also relied heavily on human labor. Walls needed repairing. Roofs needed relayering. Turf had to be replaced regularly. Firewood had to be gathered and stored. This work was physically demanding and time-consuming. In years when manpower was reduced due to disease, injury, or conflict, homes deteriorated faster. Warmth wasn't just about design, It was about constant effort. Another limitation was geographic dependence. Viking architecture worked best in regions where turf, stone, and organic materials were available. When Vikings moved into environments that lacked these resources, problems emerged. In Greenland, for example, Norse settlers initially built familiar turf homes. But colder temperatures, shorter growing seasons, and limited resources strained their system. As climate conditions worsened, maintaining homes and securing fuel became increasingly difficult. Eventually, architecture alone couldn't compensate for environmental changes. There was also a psychological limit to winter living. Long periods of darkness, confinement, smoke, and routine could wear people down mentally. While Viking culture emphasized storytelling and community, winter isolation still took a toll. Not everyone endured it equally well. Stress, conflict, and despair were real parts of winter life, even inside warm homes. Viking homes also struggled with temperature control. While they prevented freezing, they were not evenly warm. Areas far from the hearth could remain cold. Floor-level temperatures were especially low. Children, elders, and the sick were most vulnerable. Warmth was relative, not luxurious. Another important limitation was adaptability over time. Viking homes were excellent for their era, but they didn't evolve quickly. As populations grew and social structures changed, the longhouse format became less practical. Privacy needs increased. New building styles gradually replaced older ones. What worked for a family-based, agrarian society didn't always work for more complex communities. This highlights a critical truth. Viking homes were solutions, not miracles. They didn't eliminate winter hardship. They reduced it. They made survival possible, not easy. And when systems broke down, through famine, climate shifts, war, or neglect, the limits of Viking design became painfully clear. But there's something important to remember here. Failure doesn't mean failure of intelligence. Viking homes represent one of the most successful cold climate housing solutions of the pre-industrial world. Their limitations reflect the reality of life without modern technology, not poor thinking. In fact, many of these limits still exist today. Modern homes can fail just as dramatically when power grids collapse, fuel supplies are disrupted, or systems become too complex to repair. The difference is that Vikings expected hardship. Their architecture was designed with the understanding that things would go wrong, that resources would be limited, that nature would not cooperate, and that mindset may be their greatest lesson of all. Because the true strength of Viking homes wasn't that they never failed. It was that people survived when they did. Why Viking architecture is making a comeback today. For centuries, Viking architecture was dismissed as primitive, temporary, or outdated. Stone and steel replaced turf and timber. Height replaced density. Machines replaced design. And for a long time, it seemed like the Viking way of building had been left behind for good. But something interesting is happening today. Architects, environmental designers, and homeowners are quietly rediscovering ideas that Vikings mastered over 1,000 years ago. Not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. Rising energy costs, climate instability, and the demand for sustainable living are forcing modern societies to rethink how homes are built. And once again, Viking architecture makes sense. One of the biggest reasons for this comeback is energy efficiency without dependence. Modern homes consume massive amounts of energy just to stay comfortable. Heating systems work constantly, insulation degrades, and power outages turn homes into cold boxes. Viking homes, by contrast, were designed to function even when resources were scarce. Today's architects call this passive design. Vikings just called it common sense. Earth-sheltered homes, thick walls, compact layouts, and thermal mass are now being praised as cutting-edge solutions. These are the same principles Viking builders relied on to survive Arctic winters. Another reason Viking architecture is returning is climate resilience. Extreme weather is becoming more common. Heat waves, cold snaps, storms, and energy shortages are no longer rare events. Homes designed for narrow comfort ranges are failing under pressure. Viking homes were designed for extremes. They didn't rely on perfect conditions. They worked in the worst months of the year, not just the best. Modern designers are beginning to prioritize resilience over appearance, and Viking design fits perfectly into that mindset. Sustainability is another major factor. Viking homes used local materials. Turf, stone, wood, and earth came from the surrounding land. Transportation costs were minimal. When a house was abandoned, it returned to the earth without pollution. This aligns almost perfectly with modern sustainable architecture goals. Green roofs, natural insulation, low-carbon materials, and biodegradable structures are now considered forward-thinking. Vikings were doing all of this long before sustainability became a buzzword. There's also a growing rejection of overcomplicated systems. Modern buildings often rely on layers of technology that are expensive to install, maintain, and repair. When one system fails, everything else suffers. Viking homes were simple, but not simplistic. Their systems were visible, understandable, and repairable by the people living in them. In a world where self-sufficiency is becoming valuable again, that simplicity is powerful. Another reason for the comeback is human-centered design. Viking homes were built around how people actually lived. They encouraged togetherness, shared warmth, and communal life. The hearth wasn't just a heating source, it was a social center. Modern homes often isolate people into separate rooms, each with separate climate controls and devices. This increases energy use and reduces connection. Architects are now rethinking shared spaces, central living areas, and multifunctional rooms, ideas Viking homes perfected. There's also renewed interest in mental well-being. Natural materials, low ceilings, warm textures, and firelight create environments that feel safe and grounded. Viking homes were psychologically comforting during long winters, even if they were physically demanding. Modern research shows that natural materials and organic spaces reduce stress. Viking architecture didn't know the science, but it understood the effect. Another factor driving this revival is economic pressure. Not everyone can afford high-tech homes or constant energy bills. Viking-inspired designs offer affordable alternatives that reduce long-term costs. Smaller homes, passive heating, and local materials lower both construction and maintenance expenses. In uncertain economic times, that matters. There's also a cultural shift happening. People are questioning whether bigger is better, whether endless growth makes sense, whether comfort should come at the cost of environmental damage. Viking architecture represents a different philosophy, one that values balance over excess, resilience over luxury, and function over appearance. Even in cold climates today, modern turf houses, earth homes, and green roof structures are being built and tested. And they work. Not because they copy Viking homes exactly, but because they apply the same principles in modern ways. This doesn't mean we should live exactly like Vikings. We benefit from modern sanitation, lighting, and safety standards. But Viking architecture reminds us that technology should support good design, not replace it. The resurgence of Viking building principles isn't about going backward. It's about remembering what we forgot. That homes don't need to fight nature to be comfortable. That warmth doesn't have to be expensive. That survival and sustainability often come from simplicity. Viking architecture is making a comeback because the problems it solved never really went away. We just ignored the solutions for a while. And now, as the world grows colder in some ways and more uncertain in others, those ancient ideas feel surprisingly modern again. What Viking homes teach us about human survival and the future. When we look at Viking homes, it's easy to focus on the materials, the construction methods, or the clever ways they stayed warm. But the real lesson Viking homes teach us goes much deeper than architecture. It's a lesson about how humans survive, adapt, and endure when conditions are harsh and resources are limited. Viking homes remind us that survival is not about comfort. It's about stability. These homes were not built to feel luxurious. They were built to be reliable. When storms came, when darkness lasted for months, when food was scarce and fuel was precious, Viking homes continued to function. They didn't collapse under pressure. They didn't depend on systems that could fail overnight. They worked because they were designed for reality, not for ideal conditions. One of the most important lessons Viking homes teach us is that adaptation beats domination. Vikings did not try to overpower their environment. They didn't attempt to erase winter or turn it into something else. They accepted the cold and built around it. They used the earth, the wind, the snow, and even animals as part of their survival system. Modern society often tries to dominate nature with technology. But as climate challenges grow, that approach is becoming harder to sustain. Viking homes show us that adapting to nature may be more effective than fighting it. Another lesson is efficiency over excess. Viking homes wasted very little. Space was shared. Heat was conserved. Materials were reused. Everything had value because resources were limited. Today, excess is often mistaken for progress. Larger homes, more rooms, more systems, more energy use. Viking architecture challenges that mindset. It asks a simple question: how much do we actually need to survive well? The answer is often far less than we think. Viking homes also teach us the power of community. These houses were not designed for isolation. They forced people together, around the hearth, around shared meals, around shared work. Survival wasn't an individual achievement. It was collective. In times of crisis, whether environmental, economic, or social, communities that cooperate survive better than those that isolate. Viking homes physically reinforce that truth. Another crucial lesson is resilience through simplicity. Viking homes were easy to understand and repair. If something broke, people fixed it themselves. There were no hidden systems, no complicated dependencies. In the modern world, complexity often creates fragility. Viking homes remind us that simple systems fail less often and recover faster when they do. There is also a lesson about psychological survival. Long winters weren't just cold, they were mentally exhausting. Viking homes created environments where people could endure months of darkness without losing hope. Firelight, storytelling, shared routines, and meaningful work helped maintain morale. Survival isn't just physical. Mental resilience matters just as much. Viking homes supported both. Viking architecture also teaches us about respect for limits. Vikings understood that resources would run out if misused. They planned carefully, stored wisely, and accepted that some seasons required restraint. Modern society often resists limits. But the future will likely demand more awareness of boundaries, energy, materials, and environmental capacity. Viking homes didn't pretend limits didn't exist. They were built around them. Another lesson is that technology should serve design, not replace it. Viking homes succeeded without advanced tools because their design was sound. Modern homes sometimes rely on technology to compensate for poor design choices. The future of human survival may depend on reversing that approach, using technology to enhance naturally efficient structures instead of fixing inefficient ones. There is also a lesson about time. Vikings thought in seasons, not moments. Their homes were built to last through years of winter, not just look good in the present. They planned for long-term survival, not short-term comfort. In a fast-paced world obsessed with speed, Viking homes remind us that slowing down can be a strength. Perhaps the most powerful lesson Viking homes teach us is humility. These builders did not see themselves as masters of the world. They saw themselves as part of it. Their homes didn't stand apart from the landscape, they blended into it. As humanity faces an uncertain future, this mindset may matter more than any new invention. Viking homes show us that survival is not about having more. It's about needing less. It's about understanding where you live. It's about building wisely, living cooperatively, and respecting the forces around you. The future may not look like the past. But if it's going to be sustainable, resilient, and human, it will likely carry the same principles Viking homes quietly embodied centuries ago. In the end, Viking homes weren't just shelters from the cold. They were lessons in how humans endure. And those lessons are far from obsolete. Hidden secrets of Viking homes and their Arctic survival. Even after centuries, Viking homes continue to surprise us. We've covered their clever design, their resilience, and the lessons they hold for modern living. But there's more, hidden secrets that made these homes not just shelters, but marvels of survival engineering. One of the most fascinating aspects of Viking homes is how they managed moisture. Cold climates aren't just about freezing temperatures. Dampness, frost, and condensation can be as deadly as ice. Viking builders understood this intuitively. Turf walls absorbed moisture during wet spells but released it slowly when air was dry. Roofs were layered with thatch or turf that let rain run off while protecting the underlying structure. Floors were often slightly raised or packed with dry earth to prevent dampness from seeping in. This wasn't decoration, it was essential for survival, preventing rot and disease in families and animals alike. Another secret is microclimates within the home. Viking longhouses weren't uniform spaces. Different areas had slightly different temperatures, intentionally or by design. Sleeping platforms near the walls, animal areas, and the central hearth created pockets of warmth. Some spots were almost hot, while others remained cool but bearable. Vikings knew which spots to occupy for comfort and which to use for storage. In this way, even one fire could heat the home efficiently, without wasting energy on unused spaces. Vikings also leveraged recycled heat in clever ways. Smoke from the hearth wasn't just a byproduct, it circulated slowly through the upper reaches of the house before escaping. This helped warm the air and dry surfaces while keeping dangerous sparks away from sleeping areas. In some settlements, small vented corridors funneled smoke into secondary rooms to preserve warmth for storage, seeds, or even delicate tools. Every ember, every puff of smoke, was purposeful. Food storage was another hidden survival technique. Viking homes were designed with integrated storage zones that stayed cool enough to prevent spoilage yet were protected from freezing. Root cellars, elevated platforms, and earth-covered storage pits kept vegetables, grains, and preserved meats at stable temperatures. This careful planning meant that families could survive long winters without starving, even if outdoor hunting or gathering became impossible. Another little-known fact is that Viking homes were surprisingly fireproof when managed properly. While open hearths were a risk, thick turf walls and stone foundations were remarkably resistant to fire spread. Sparks might ignite thatch roofs occasionally, but repairs were straightforward, and entire structures rarely went up in flames. Viking communities developed a routine of maintaining homes constantly during winter, which minimized hazards. Regular upkeep wasn't optional, it was survival. Even the orientation of Viking homes reveals hidden genius. Entrances were deliberately positioned to avoid prevailing winds. Windows, if present, were placed strategically to maximize sunlight during the shortest days. The roof slope was calculated to shed heavy snow while allowing a layer to remain as insulation. Everything was observed, tested, and adjusted over generations. Vikings also had a deep understanding of human energy conservation. They knew the value of staying dry, staying dressed, and staying close to heat sources. Warm clothing, layered bedding, and careful positioning in the longhouse meant that human bodies required less fuel-generated heat. Survival was as much about behavior as it was about walls. Perhaps the most impressive hidden secret is their long-term environmental awareness. Viking builders didn't strip landscapes for building materials. They reused wood, harvested turf sustainably, and respected the seasonal limitations of their environment. This careful stewardship allowed settlements to endure for centuries without exhausting local resources. It's a lesson in sustainable living that feels modern but was mastered long ago. Finally, there's an element often overlooked: psychological comfort. The design of the longhouse, compact, communal, and hearth-centered, created safety, familiarity, and routine. Long winters can be mentally harsh, but Viking homes provided a predictable environment. The smell of fire, the warmth of shared bodies, the sound of wind and animals outside, all of it helped families maintain a sense of normalcy. Humans survived not just because of insulation, but because Viking homes preserved morale. All these hidden secrets reveal one truth: Viking homes were not simple huts. They were integrated survival systems, blending materials, design, and human behavior in ways that allowed life to continue in some of the harshest climates on Earth. Every choice, from roof slope to hearth placement, was deliberate and tested over generations. They teach us that survival is holistic. It's about materials, energy, behavior, community, and mental resilience all working together. Even today, as we build modern houses with central heating, insulation, and advanced materials, Viking homes remind us that the most powerful design isn't always the newest. It's the one that respects the environment, maximizes efficiency, and aligns with human needs. And in that alignment lies the true secret of their enduring legacy. Surviving extreme Viking winters, lessons from Scandinavia to Greenland. Viking winters were not just cold, they were extreme. From the fjords of Norway to the icy reaches of Greenland, Viking homes faced challenges that would test any building. And yet, year after year, families survived. Understanding how they did it reveals lessons about human endurance, adaptation, and the limits of architecture. In Norway and Denmark, winters were long and dark, but moderate compared to the Arctic extremes. Snow could pile high, winds howled through fjords, and temperatures regularly fell below freezing. Viking homes in these regions relied heavily on thick turf walls, heavy thatched roofs, and central hearths. Livestock was kept inside or adjacent to the living space, providing natural heat. Here, shared warmth and compact layouts ensured that even in sub-zero temperatures, indoor life remained manageable. Iceland presented a greater challenge. Vikings who settled there faced longer winters, stronger winds, and fewer trees. Timber was scarce, forcing settlers to rely almost entirely on turf, stone, and driftwood for construction. Homes had to be exceptionally insulated. Archaeological evidence shows partially buried homes with sunken floors and turf walls nearly a meter thick. Smoke from the hearth was carefully managed to maximize heat retention. Even small mistakes in maintenance could make a house nearly uninhabitable during the coldest months. Greenland was perhaps the ultimate test. Vikings who migrated there experienced Arctic winters that stretched from October to May. Temperatures could drop below -20 degrees Celsius, and storms were frequent. Timber was even scarcer than in Iceland, and turf was often thin or frozen. Yet Norse settlers adapted. Homes were built partially underground, using stone foundations and thick turf walls. Hearths were maintained almost constantly, and animal heat was maximized. Storage pits for food were insulated with earth to prevent freezing. Even then, survival depended on meticulous planning and community support. When winters were particularly harsh, or supplies ran low, Entire settlements suffered. Archaeological records suggest that some homes were abandoned or rebuilt repeatedly due to extreme conditions. One common factor across all regions was understanding microclimates. Vikings intuitively knew where to build relative to winds, sunlight, and sheltering terrain. Homes were often positioned with entrances away from prevailing winds, walls oriented to catch the least exposure, and roofs sloped to handle heavy snow. Even small adjustments could mean the difference between warmth and near-freezing interiors. Another crucial adaptation was lead heating and insulation. Viking homes weren't just relying on one source of warmth. The hearth, body heat, animal heat, lead clothing, fur bedding, and even snow on the roof all worked together. It was a system, not a single solution. Without this holistic approach, extreme winters would have been deadly. Extreme winters also highlighted the limits of Viking design. In Greenland, for example, some settlements eventually declined or disappeared entirely. Houses alone could not compensate for insufficient food, fuel shortages, or environmental shifts. Survival required more than architecture. It required foresight, resource management, and community cohesion. Viking homes were remarkable, but even they could not defeat the harshest winters when combined with human error or environmental challenges. Despite these limits, Viking homes succeeded far more often than they failed. Families endured months of darkness, bitter cold, and isolation because their homes were intelligently designed. The longhouse, turf walls, central hearths, and sunken floors were all tested repeatedly, refined over generations, and adapted to local conditions. These extreme cases also reveal lessons for today. Modern buildings in cold climates face similar challenges: energy costs, harsh storms, and reliance on systems that can fail. Viking homes teach that adaptation, simplicity, and holistic design often outperform sheer technological complexity. Passive heating, thermal mass, earth insulation, and strategic orientation are not just historical curiosities, they are practical solutions for modern survival in extreme conditions. Vikings didn't just endure winter, they studied it, respected it, and built homes that allowed them to thrive despite it. From Norway's fjords to Greenland's icy plains, their architecture reveals a mindset that valued observation, preparation, and resilience over comfort alone. It's a mindset that can inspire how we design, build, and survive in extreme climates today. Even centuries later, the story of Viking winters reminds us that survival is rarely about domination. It's about intelligence, foresight, and cooperation. Viking homes weren't perfect, they had limits, but they were as close as humans could get to thriving in the coldest corners of the world. The last word: Viking homes and the art of survival. Viking homes were more than buildings. They were survival machines, social hubs, and lessons in efficiency, adaptation, and resilience. Across centuries and continents, from Norway to Iceland to Greenland, these structures allowed humans to endure some of the harshest winters on Earth. And while they were not perfect, the lessons they offer remain remarkably relevant today. The genius of Viking homes lay in their simplicity and integration. Every choice: the thick turf walls, the low ceilings, the central hearth, the sunken floors, was part of a system designed for survival. Heat was retained, moisture managed, resources conserved, and people kept close. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was accidental. Even smoke, often seen as a nuisance, was harnessed to dry, warm, and protect the home. Every aspect of design reflected centuries of observation and adaptation. Yet Viking homes were also a reminder that even the best designs have limits. Extreme winters, resource shortages, and environmental changes tested them relentlessly. Some settlements failed, homes had to be rebuilt, and lives were lost. Architecture alone could not guarantee survival. It required foresight, planning, and cooperation. And in those failures, too, there is a lesson: Resilience is as much about human behavior and community as it is about walls, roofs, or fires. These structures also offer a deeper insight into human psychology and culture. Winter was long, dark, and often unforgiving. Yet the design of the longhouse encouraged togetherness, storytelling, and shared purpose. Physical warmth and emotional security went hand in hand. Survival was not simply about keeping frostbite at bay, it was about sustaining morale, health, and family cohesion through months of isolation. The modern relevance of Viking homes cannot be overstated. In an era of energy crises, climate uncertainty, and over-engineered housing, their principles are being rediscovered. Compact, insulated structures that prioritize passive heating, natural materials, and strategic orientation are not just eco-friendly, they are fundamentally resilient. Viking wisdom reminds us that survival does not require endless technology. It requires thoughtful design, observation, and harmony with the environment. From fuel management to animal integration, from microclimates to community living, Viking homes were sophisticated solutions that balanced nature, resources, and human needs. They teach us that resilience is multidimensional. It is architectural, social, behavioral, and psychological. They also remind us that when technology fails, adaptability matters most. Finally, Viking homes remind us that survival is a holistic practice. It's about anticipating challenges, using available resources wisely, and living in alignment with the environment rather than in opposition to it. It's about understanding limits, preparing carefully, and supporting each other through difficult conditions. In a world increasingly shaped by climate extremes, resource limitations, and technological fragility, the lessons of Viking homes remain profound. They show us that durability is not always found in steel and concrete, but in intelligent simplicity, thoughtful design, and the human capacity to adapt. They show us that warmth, comfort, and survival do not come from domination over nature, but from working with it. Viking homes were not just shelters, they were masterclasses in resilience. And long after the snow has melted, the lessons they offer endure.